Hello, Frizzle Federation. I'm going to be ranking for you the last 10 books I read. And let's just say up front that my reading recently has not been going particularly well, so this is going to be a very ranty video. Until the end when we get to my favorite book, okay? Okay. Starting with rank 10, Blunt Force Magic. And I gave up on this one so quickly. The writing style was utterly revolting to me. It took the overly sexist noir kind of trends of writing and mixed it with overly flowery until we get things like this, and no. I gave up on that book at 8%. Rank 9 is Cleon Moon. This is book 5 in the Fallen Empire series, where in a Star Wars-like universe we are following a ex-rebellion fighter pilot. And she is trying to get across the galaxy to find her missing daughter. And along the way, she gains a bunch of sidekicks, including some people who were working for the Empire before, and they have their own quests that keep getting in the way of hers. Now, I really loved book 1 of this series, and then my enjoyment of each book has been slowly going down until the point when we hit here at book 5, I'm done. I'm so angry at this book at this point because book 1, so much promise because we had this beautiful enemies to lovers being set up in book 1. The plot was fast-paced and fun and just crafted with all of the joy. And then in book 2, like nothing happened to move the plot forward. And then in book 3, like nothing happened to move the plot forward. And then in book 4, like nothing happened to move the plot forward. And then book 5, oh guess what? Nothing happened. And it just feels like the entire series is spinning its wheels where we don't have any character development or relationship development or really plot development happening ever. And it's just side quests that feel increasingly less relevant or important to what matters to our characters. Which is just like, makes me want to scream, because when I picked up book 1, I was thinking, I love this. I love the way this author writes, and I need to pick up everything she has ever written. And then I kept picking up her books, and the more that I've picked them up, the more I've hated them. So I gave Cleon Moon 2 stars, and its book tone is Vermilion Red. Book tone is a reader personality test that I designed. Every book and every reader fits into one of 14 personality types. The darker colors are the emotional types. The paler colors are the intellectual types. The yellows are atmosphere, world-building focused. The blues are character relationship focused, and the reds are plot action focused. So this book being at Vermilion Red means that it is emotional and plot focused. If you want to learn more, I'll have my video and personality test linked in the footnotes. Rank 9 is Every Which Way But Dead. This is book 3 in an urban fantasy series following a witch who is a bounty hunter, and she's gotten very involved in vampire and demon traps and politics. And this book is her navigating a lot of those sticky situations that have been set up in books 1 and 2. And this is very much following on the trend of I liked the first book I read from the series and then we've gone downhill because I loved book 2 and I had such high hopes for this series, and then we get this book 3 and I'm like, where did the plot go? It just feels like the characters pinballing from event to event and none of them matter. Like the stakes, both life and death and emotional, are at like 0 at this point, and we're just kissing vampires and having random plot points occur. And I tried so hard to push through this book. I was in the middle of reading this book for like 3 weeks, which is unheard of for me, and I finally had to give up at 76% and admit to myself that I really didn't like this book, despite really loving the one that came before it. One of the biggest conflicts this book sets itself up with is that our protagonist has made a deal with a demon, and now that demon is coming to collect her soul. And this problem gets pretty quickly 80% solved at the beginning of the book, and then the rest of the book is just the demon kind of showing up and being like, what about that other 20%? And she being like, go away, and then he does. And then the book failed to provide us with like any other interesting dynamic conflicts for her to solve, so meh. Where'd the plot go? I don't know, but it wasn't in this book. I gave Every Which Way But Dead 2 stars, and its book tone is Jade Green. Rank 7 is A Pillar of Light. This is a historical fiction following a family in 1830s New York, and it's about their family drama and love triangles and also their interactions with the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormonism. I read this as part of a video where my husband picked what books I read, so if you want a more thorough review of it, I'll link that down in the footnotes for you. Read this because it was one of his favorite books, and it just reinforced to me how much I don't love historical fiction. I'm sure out there somewhere is a historical fiction that I would like, but it's not this one where our protagonists are always on the periphery of actual important fun events. It's definitely not this one with random historical info dumps that never become plot relevant. It's definitely not this one where the love triangle is just so bungled and I hate the female lead in it. It's definitely not this one that repeatedly avoids emotional confrontational scenes and instead has them happen off screen. The silver lining of this is that I read this book alongside my husband, and it was a lot of fun to hear his takes on it and to discuss it with him because it is one of his favorite books from his childhood. I mean, yeah, a lot of those discussions was me making fun of it and him defending it because it's one of his favorite books from his childhood, but it was a very wholesome experience. I gave The Pillar of Light 2 stars, and its book tone is Celadon Green. Rank 6 is Fluency. This is a sci-fi romance book following a group of astronauts. There is a seemingly abandoned alien spaceship that has parked itself out in the solar system, and they are on an expedition to go see what's up and explore it. We are mostly following Dr. Jane Halloway, a distinguished linguist, and she quickly makes telepathic contact with the entity still living on this ship. And then the rest of the plot is various, oh no, we have to survive in space because of all these ship malfunctions and problems that are happening. And then we're also following the perspective of one of the astronauts who's an engineer who's on this expedition and their romance. Now, I really loved the beginning of this book. I felt like it has such a strong beginning. I was excited for the romance to start going. I was super intrigued with what was happening on this ship, and then the romance actually started up. And I picked up this book because I knew it had a romance in it and I was looking for sci-fi romance. And yet, the romance is why I hated this book, because it was just completely fumbled, did not feel romantic, gave me the ick in most scenes. And then that leaves this book in this limbo where some people are picking it up because they want like a hard sci-fi book, and then they're disappointed by how much of the plot is dedicated to this romance they didn't want. And then me, who went into this looking for a good romance, is also disappointed. And there's a few parts of it why this fundamentally fails, and if you want more rant on it, I will link it down in the footnotes, but the overview is, the guy was always very crushing on the girl, but it was never really reciprocated. The one steamy scene was fundamentally misused, icky, and terrible. I hated it. It was my least favorite scene of the whole book. And this book just absolutely fails to balance the romance and the action because it's so much like, okay, you're in a life and death situation, now is not the time to be flirting. And they went overboard without ever giving really an explanation, and also I didn't ship it, so like. But because I did really love the first half of this book, I gave it 3 stars. And its book tone is Thistle Purple. Rank 5 is Life on the Border. This is a short story collection that all takes place in the same interesting city. It's urban fantasy, and it's a city where the elf lands of fairy have mixed with the mortal world, and there's one melting pot city that is right on the edge of lawlessness. My favorite stories in the collection were Never Never, a story about a man who's been cursed to be like kind of a werewolf figure, and then he finds the elf that cursed him years ago and starts setting a trap for her. But then along the way of setting a trap for her, he kind of gets to know her and lets go of his thirst for revenge. I also loved Rain and Thunder, a story kind of about gang wars between the humans and the elves, and them getting into various skirmishes and arguments, and then also coming back together. You might sense the trend that I really love stories that have like happy endings, and yeah. But there were also quite a few stories in this collection that I didn't love, including Reynardine, which was about like this elf monster preying on human children and was just kind of like icky and not compelling. And by far the worst in the collection, Light and Shadow, which was a story about movie characters coming to life but seemed more like an excuse just to have like these quirky one-dimensional sexist characters out in the world. And when I averaged out all my star ratings for the stories in this anthology, I got 3 stars. So that's what this one got. Rank 4 is Senlin Ascends. This book is wacky. It feels like an epic fantasy twist on Alice in Wonderland, but following a middle-aged professor. This professor is journeying to the Tower of Babel, this twisted, magical place that he's always dreamed of going, and he's going on his honeymoon. Then when he gets to the tower, he quickly loses track of his wife, and then is exploring the tower trying to find her again, and in the process, getting into quite a lot of trouble. My main feeling reading this book was that it was exhausting. We were always bouncing from just absurd thing to absurd thing, and it never felt like there was progress being made. Despite there being a lot of little adventures that were compelling in isolation, it never felt like things really strung together. And a lot of my experience with this book for the first 2/3 was like, oh, this book is exhausting, it's so strange, it's so random, we're always bringing up all of these new little details and like, these are never gonna be important, right? And then, in the last third of the book, more of those details became important. Things kept coming around and around again. Like, I had thought in the first half of the book that all of these 𝐂𝐸𝐿 guns were like completely unloaded and just a waste of my brain power. And then in the end of the book, they like all went off, which was pretty satisfying. I definitely felt like the end of this book was the part that I loved the most, but I don't think I can say that I loved the whole book. But I did love the reading experience because I read this as part of my book club. I run a book club on Discord for my patrons. It's only a few dollars a month to join if you want to jump in. And we had such interesting discussions talking about Senlin Ascends. And the book we are reading next is this one. I gave Senlin Ascends 3 stars, and I don't think I'm going to be continuing on with the series. But I don't regret reading it because it was quite a ride. And its book tone is Celadon Green. Now you might be thinking that because we're already to rank 3, we're getting to the books that I loved, but not so. Like I said at the beginning, this month of reading was quite a month of duds. Rank 3 is Ruthless Vows. This is the sequel to Divine Rivals. I have quite an interesting relationship with Divine Rivals because I read that book before it ever came out, before there was any hype for it, and I loved it. But I felt like the ending was particularly weak. And then later it got all hyped and blew up all over the internet. And now we are reading book 2. And there is quite a lot of pressure from the internet on this book now. And me, and it seems like many other people, are disappointed because this one just wasn't as good as book 1. These books take place in a World War These books take place in a World War I era fantasy world where we are following Iris and Kit, 2 reporters who are rivals for the same columnist promotion. And then they are also secretly writing each other anonymous magical letters and bonding through that. And then there's this war that is sponsored by the gods and they get tangled up in that and reporting about it. I felt like book 1 really nailed good character arcs for both of our protagonists. It really nailed helping me feel their emotions. It nailed helping me feel their romance and shipping it. All the emotions of this book were just leaping off the page and seeping into my soul, and I loved it. But then, by the end of the book, it felt like we were just getting kind of cheap plot twists that were setting up for book 2 and not really like sticking any of the landings of all of these great things that had been setting up all book. And I was really hoping that I would like this one more than book 1. But I don't feel like book 2 nailed the emotions because I barely cared about these characters and their plights, and a lot of that was because this book didn't have any character development for them. We get like a little bit of amnesia trope for one of our characters, but that's kind of quickly and somewhat cheaply resolved in my opinion. It feels like a lot of just repeating the beats we had in book 1, but less good. And then this book in the middle, I started really clicking with it because we were building up to such an emotional, bombastic ending. There's this big god-propelled war happening and they are getting more and more involved in it, and I was excited to see the big showdown. And then this book like totally shot itself in the foot with the pacing at the end of it. We're like just around the climax, it started throwing in a bunch of new perspectives and the blocking of the scenes started like decomposing, so it was harder and harder to tell what was happening in the scenes as the writing style shifted from more like lyrical, poetic, beautiful language to more like fast-paced, go dramatic language, but I feel like the author didn't actually nail that. And it was so weird because with all of these different plot lines, we'd have like big bombastic conclusion and then like slow resolution time, and then big conclusion and then slow resolution time, and then big conclusion and then slow resolution time. Instead of like building all the conclusions on each other, they like stutter stopped. And just by like moving around a bunch of scenes in the ending part of this book, I feel like it could have been so much stronger and punched with way more emotional force. But like in the end, Ruthless Vows was fine and I liked my time with it. I gave it 3 stars. and its book tone is Anchor Gray. Rank 2 gets to go to We Are Legion and its sequel For We Are Many. These books have been on my want to read for quite a long time, one of the only books that I put on my most anticipated books of 2023 list that I didn't actually end up getting to. But here, at the beginning of the year, I have gotten around to it. This story follows a man named Bob. He is very nerdy, he's a software engineer, and he dies at the beginning of the book, and then wakes up like 200 years later as an AI. They harvested his brain and made him into a computer, and his task is now to be the controlling brain of a space probe that's going out to explore the galaxy. And if he doesn't want this job, then they'll just turn him off. So he's very excited about this job. And I really loved the first half of book 1. There was so much exploring and striving in these books, with Bob really getting to know his new environment, what he can do, and pushing the boundaries, learning and growing on every page. So as Bob adjusted to his life, started experiencing troubles out in the galaxy and solving them in interesting ways, I loved it. And then we got to the point where the narrative momentum pivots, where Bob makes a bunch of clones of himself, which is why the book is called We Are Legion. And then we start following, pretty much every single one of these clones as they all go out and have their own galactic adventures. And though every single one of these plot lines was fine, I didn't love any of them. And a lot of that is because, though, in the first half of the book, it really felt like Bob was being emotionally challenged and intellectually challenged, and he was constantly remaking and redefining himself. Second half of the book, not so much of that energy. It was more just like, hey, I found a cool thing out in space. Let's look at it for a while and do some things about it. Okay, yep. And it felt very reactionary, where instead of our protagonist having real, strict goals that he wants to go out and making things happen, he's just going out and watching things happen and sometimes interfering. This feeling intensified as I got into book 2 for We Are Many, where, again, we're following so many different Bob clones as the clones have made more clones, and it felt like every single chapter would start with hey, while you were gone, this fun thing happened. And here's our plan for dealing with it. We're gonna deal with it. It's gonna be a little hard, but it'll be okay. And then we switch to another Bob on a different place in the galaxy who has just encountered a new problem, and then he reacts to it, and that's the end of that chapter. But we never followed enough of the Bobs for me to really get invested in what they were doing, for me to really feel like they had a plan that I got to watch play out. The entire book felt all like reaction and no action. I gave these books on average 3.5 stars. I liked them, and I would even say that I loved the first half of book 1, but in the end, I don't think I'm going to continue on with the series, and their book tone, I would say, lands around Xanthus Orange. Now, we are up to rank number 1, and as promised, this is the one book that I loved this month. So get ready for a gush review, because I've deserved it after all of those negative reviews. This is Demon Daughter, which is the 12th book in the Penric and Desdemona series. This is a high fantasy series following a man named Penric, and when he was a teenager, he accidentally contracted a demon named Desdemona. And this gives him marvelous powers and also lots of responsibility because he is now a church employee because they have jurisdiction over the demons. So throughout the series is a bunch of his little adventures, going and solving various problems around the kingdoms, getting to know his own demonic powers along the way. Demon Daughter happens at the very end of the timeline so far. He's had decades of adventures, he's settled down, and he has a family, and here comes another adventure knocking on his door, which is there is a little girl in a nearby town who has accidentally contracted a demon. And things are not going so well for her. So then Penric takes a very mentorship role over her as she's learning how to deal with this, and they're trying to decide whether or not she should keep it. And there's a lot of discussions in this novel about the pros and cons of these demonic powers, about what they really mean to a person and how they interact with the world. And it was also just really cute, heartwarming story about this little girl whose life is upended, but then she finds a new family in the course of it, and finds new strength and emotional resilience because of it. And this book, I loved it. It had great internal conflict for every single character as they tried to unpick this sticky knot. It had really compelling, heartwarming scenes as everyone was getting to know each other and adjusting to each other. It cleverly built upon the past 11 books in this series and gave us a new adventure where we hadn't quite explored all these facets of demon magic yet. It perfectly added on the series while giving us also a contained adventure that you could just read as a standalone and still love. The pacing was excellent. The characters were excellent. I highly recommend the series as a whole. I gave Demon Daughter 4 stars. Yes, there's not a single 5-star in this video. But we are hoping that I will get one soon. Tune in for the future videos and I'm sure I'll be gushing about something else even more. And its book tone is uranium blue. And if you liked this video, I think you'll love my other recent reads like this one.